Hello and welcome to tonight's podcast. Before we get going with that, I would just like to have a quick word about today's sponsor, CABI, the Community Assembly of the British Isles. We are constantly seeking solutions, and it is evident that complete unity among the people is essential for us to reclaim our power. I believe the Community Assembly of the British Isles represents the best option available. CABI's goal is to transform every community into a powerful entity, creating a vast network of strong communities. It is the people who should determine how we live our lives, and it is the people who can empower themselves to make this a reality. The Community Assembly of the British Isles is a great facilitator in helping to bring this vision to fruition. Since its inception pre-2020, CABI has been steadfast in its mission, actively facilitating change across the British Isles. Click in the video description link below to find out so much more, and sign up free today. Let's take back the power. Now please do enjoy the podcast.
Are you concerned about all this corruption being misgendered as conspiracies? Well, don't you worry. Sit back, relax and join in the conversation as we talk with today's guest. Welcome to another LSB Film Productions podcast with your host, Chris Brooks.
Hello and welcome to the channel. It's me, Chris Brooks, for another LSB Film podcast. Today's guest, I am joined with Michael Blowman. And Michael Blowman has a career in chemical engineering, and Michael is going to show us a presentation on climate change and why it actually isn't what they say it is. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'd just like to say also that I am a member of CABI.
Yes, of course.
The Assembly of the British Isles, which is growing, and we have lots of members, and they are individually. We have now 103 community assemblies in the land. They're growing. They grow organically now, of course, with other members joining, because we're, unlike other groups, we're actually creating an infrastructure for the alternative society, because otherwise it's just a cozy chat group if you haven't got anything behind it.
No, absolutely.
So,
well, CABI have this month's sponsors for our channel, so a shout out to CABI. The guys would have just seen my introduction about CABI before this podcast, so let's move on from that and let's get into this presentation.
Okay, so let me start the presentation from the beginning.
Brilliant.
Global warming news. Now, I just want to put these proposals to you. Fake or real? The government are proposing that to combat climate change and reduce carbon emissions, they're going to introduce an act to ban the manufacture, distribution, and sale of beer, lager, cider, carbonated drinks, mixers, soda water, lemonades, because they contain CO2. So when you open the bottle, you're going to release it. In addition, there'll be a ban on the manufacture or import of champagne, prosecco, or sparkling wines. What about this one? Local councils are considering introducing a compulsory houseplant scheme. Every room in the house must have a houseplant. It will be an offence not to comply, as plants absorb the carbon dioxide that we exhale and contributes to lowering CO2 levels responsible for climate change. Plans to recruit HPIs are another way of extracting money. Houseplant inspectors are being formulated, and they will be responsible for carrying out random house checks to ensure compliance and issue fines if householders have not complied. So, which of those two proposals are preposterous and absurd?
Both.
How about this third statement then? Man-made carbon emissions leading to increases in CO2 are responsible for climate change. The answer? None of these statements are true and are totally absurd. Let's have a look at a climate change expert that quoted in, remember, climate change expert, quoted in 2018 the following. Oh, yes.
How dare you?
The great Greta Thunberg, her 2018 prediction. Didn't turn out so well, did it? She's
They never
warning
do.
that climate change will wipe out all humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. So, what did she also say? Global warming will melt the ice caps at the polar caps, and low-lying coastal areas around the world will submerge.
I would just like to say something there, just really quickly, because somebody did say to me a little while ago when I did a video on like the caps, and they said what a lot of people don't realise is that a lot of the glaciers that they refer to melting are actually on land.
Yeah.
So it's not like the ice caps in the water, so the weight's already there. So when it melts, it doesn't really make any difference. They're referring to water that's on the, or ice that's on the land. So when it melts and that goes into the sea, then that would make a difference.
Yes, but that does not, which they don't show you, show that while certain parts, I think it's in the west of the Antarctic, some of that is melting, the polar cap at the Arctic is growing.
Yes.
So, sorry, that debunks that. What I'm saying here is if melting polar caps that are in the water, okay, let's go with that one. Okay, I'll buy that one. Because of global warming start to melt, then low-lying areas of the world will submerge. Well, I must remember to drink my gin and tonic crammed with ice quickly. Otherwise, if I wait, it's going to overflow all over my feet, isn't it? Let's have a look at the water cycle, which is very important. This is part of science. There are 3 states of water: gas, liquid, and solid. The only difference between the 3 is the amount of thermal energy they possess. So if it's a gas, it's a lot of thermal energy, and the molecules are running around like demented wasps in the autumn. Okay? When it loses, the molecules are closer together and it becomes a liquid. When it freezes, it becomes crystalline. You see the crystals of ice. However, the important bit is that when water freezes, it's the only molecule that expands when it's solid. Meaning the opposite, when it melts, it contracts. So the volume is reduced. Okay? Yeah. That explains this business of as I said, thermal energy is what decides whether the gas is liquid or solid. Provided
is it a bigger mass because of the, I don't know, is it because the trapped oxygen within the ice? Does that make it bigger?
No. It's a crystalline situation that occurs in water. It's the only molecule. There are some metals at very high temperature, which don't concern us, that will expand. But water is the only one at normal temperatures that expands. Of any molecule you want to name. Now, main providers of thermal energy: solar energy, radiation from the sun. There is a little bit of geothermal energy that comes from the Earth's core, but very little. So, if we start to look at the real science, let's have a look at a Nobel Peace Prize winner who said climate crisis narrative is a hoax. Clauser, winner of the 2022 Nobel Physics Prize and one of the leading authorities on quantum mechanics. He blasted climate emergency claims as a dangerous corruption of science that threatens the world's economy and the well-being of billions of people. Eminent man speaking the truth. He said that misguided climate science is a hoax that is being driven by massive shock journalistic pseudoscience. Well, we know that, we've seen it. MSM and everything else. They just repeat this garbage. Claims of a climate crisis are being promoted around the globe by governments and their media accomplices in an effort to comply with the green agenda goals of the World Economic Forum, United Nations, World Health Organization, and other unelected globalist organizations. Meeting these goals typically involve plans to slash the quality of life for most of the general public while ramping up taxes to save the planet. Yeah, as if we have a crisis. So, this is a quote from a guy that I've met several times, Piers Corbyn.
Oh, the wonderful Piers that never turned up
The
for his
wonderful
podcast.
Piers. I've met him several times, and I use a couple of his very, very good examples in my presentation here. He said, man-made global warming caused by CO2 levels is nonsense. I've discussed this with him because I went to seek him out with my views as well. He said, in the long run, and this is true, CO2 levels are not an effect, not a cause of changes in climate temperatures. And it's the sun that drives climate. Of course, it's the giver of thermal energy. Climate emergency narrative states that a trace gas, CO2, this is how ridiculous it is, 0.04% of the air, of the atmosphere, is the main control knob for weather extremes and climate. And man's CO2 contribution of this 0.04%, meaning 0.016% of the atmosphere, is a major factor in this. Well, let's go and have a look. Let's put the climate change narrative in perspective, and I love this analogy. Imagine that the atmosphere is represented by the bell tower at the Houses of Parliament, 317 feet tall. The level of CO2 in the atmosphere, therefore, is about 1.5 inches from the top. Therefore, man's contribution of 4% of that is between 1 and 2 millimeters, pigeon droppings, compared to the rest of the atmosphere. And we're expected to believe by what climate alarmists say that our CO2 contribution drives global warming. Well, anyone can see it's nonsense. Let's have a look then at something else he said. And this is very true. Today's level of CO2 is nearly the lowest it has been, dangerously low, as plants are struggling. And of course, if plants die, so do we. There'll be no oxygen. The more CO2 in the atmosphere, the better for ecology, vegetation, and better for us. In fact, if we go back in time, we know that there were prosperous periods in Europe about 800 years ago where vegetation was plentiful, food was plentiful, and the economies grew. This is a very important statement in physics. Matter can neither be created or destroyed. In other words, it remains. Yes, it can change its form from one molecule to a compound to something else, but you cannot create more matter of that particular type than already exists. Even mankind's 4% emissions of 0.04 cannot be created. We can't create more CO2 than already exists. And this is related to what happens in nature. Everything in nature that occurs is cyclic. Nature's role is there to provide and create an equilibrium. The fact that it never does so is good, because otherwise there'd be no transfer of energy or anything like that. So, but it's continually striving to create equilibrium. And you can see this when you look at, weather maps. It's impossible to say that any interacting cycle that takes place in nature can attribute global warming to any element or molecule. There are so many interacting cycles going on every millisecond. Which one is causing the problem? There's no computer of whatever size and power can determine what it is. It's all supposition. These are the cycles that occur in nature: solar cycles, lunar cycles, magnetic cycles, ocean cycles, tidal flows, oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, jet stream cycle, pressure and temperature variations. They're occurring all the time. They all have different time periods. Let's have a look. If we're looking at the pressure and temperature relationship, Boyle's law states that pressure times volume, K is a constant, so ignore that, is equivalent to that times the temperature, meaning that at a constant volume, if air pressure increases, then temperature increases. How do you know that? Well, if you look at a weather map, you will see here are the temperatures shown on a European weather map, and correspondingly, you can see in the areas where there's high temperature, there is high pressure. And conversely, there is a balance that nature creates. If there's high pressure over say, the UK, giving a high temperature, there is lower pressure if you look further down, just below Algeria, because it's a balance. Now, if we go and look at the solar cycle, it goes from peak to peak every 11 years. In 2019-20, the sun entered a period of low activity. However, the 24th cycle beginning in 2008, when sunspots and overactive were at a minimum. Now, we are now in cycle 25. There is more sunspot activity than in cycle 24. And this is expected to peak in 2025. Well, that's very convenient for the global alarmists of global warming, isn't it? Because temperatures will rise if there's more solar energy. The sun's responsible for this thermal energy. No doubt MSM will emphasize any increase in temperatures down to man-made CO2s when the temperature comes. Governments may also demand that we have a climate emergency lockdown to protect the planet. You think that's unfeasible? Well, we know what happens with those things. The lunar cycle, however, lasts 18.6 years. This is also important because the moon is responsible for stabilizing the climate. It has a magnetic pull, gravitational pull on the moon and vice versa. The moon stabilizes the tilt of the Earth at 23 degrees. That's why the equator has higher temperatures, because it's exposed more to solar radiation. That's why we have those temperature differences. However, we do know the moon creates tidal flows, high to low, which affect the movement of ocean currents, which obviously affects weather by the amount of warm or cold water moving into a given area. And we know warm air rises, so it affects air pressure and thereby temperature. It's part of a cycle. Why is the last fact important? Because the oceans are the biggest storers of CO2, holding more than 50 times the CO2 than the atmosphere. as the sea warms, it emits CO2 from the ocean. If it cools, it will absorb CO2 from the air. This is the balance provided by nature. If extra CO2 is emitted from sea in warm periods, it's absorbed by the deep cold currents, say around Greenland. That's the balance that nature creates.
Mm-hmm.
So let's have a look at the lunar cycle. Does the moon influence weather? Yeah. In the 1990s, scientists showed the moon has an ability to generate an atmospheric tide, a gaseous pulse that creates daily changes in air pressure and soil temperature. It also alters circulation patterns of subtropical high pressure temperature belts, and that would explain observation that lunar phases are linked to cloudiness, hurricane formation, and rainfall.
You should stick half on that as well.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. The moon definitely influences weather, in addition to the sun. Let's go and have a look at this cycle, the ocean flow cycle. This is again thanks to Piers Corbin. If we look at this map, you can see in the blue the cold water coming from the Arctic, flowing all the way through to the Pacific and Indian Ocean, where it is warmed because of the solar radiation. And that is where the CO2 degasses from the ocean. Now, it takes 500 to 800 years for this flow of water. So the emission of CO2 in the warm period is not a cause of global warming, it's an effect of warming. As I've just said, it takes 500 to 800 years for this cycle to occur. So let's go and have a look at the oxygen cycle. The current increase in CO2 levels in the last 100 years is an after effect of the medieval warm period some 500 to 800 years ago. We didn't have any diesel transport, industrial use of fossil fuels, aircraft 500 to 800 years ago. So why was there an increase in CO2 levels? We've just explained that. Back then, grapes were grown in Kent. Crops grew faster and economies in Europe boomed. So the increase in CO2 at that time wasn't a problem for the climate, was it? Fake science claim the extra CO2 that appears after temperature rise make it extra warm. So does that mean that the molecule CO2 itself has warming powers? So that would mean a peak after the peak, and so on and so on. So if we look at that, then this is an interesting one. An American double glazing company latched onto this fake science to manufacture better double glazing by putting CO2 into the glass sandwich. Yes, CO2 can be an insulator, but how did CO2 know? They went bust. Because how did CO2 know which was the inside or the outside of the window? Was it heating the outside or heating the inside? Fake science.
Don't know.
The idea being that the CO2 in the sandwich sends extra heat back to the other side is preposterous, because the second law of thermodynamics says a receiving object cannot get hotter than its source. In other words, heat always travels downhill. If you put two metal containers next to each other, side by side, one with hot water, one with cold water, does the cold water give the hot water more heat, or is it the other way around? It goes downhill. They come to the same temperature ultimately. If this was possible, that are joining radiation, right, absorption emissions, if CO2 had magical powers, then we could have something for nothing. We could power a heat engine forever. Oh, how are our scientists not been able to discover this? So let's have a look at the carbon cycle. This is another cycle. Plants and vegetation, by sunlight, through photosynthesis, absorb CO2, emit the oxygen they don't need, and keep the carbon for their structure. The structure of vegetation is based on carbon. When they die, decay, the organisms then feed on this matter, okay? And they produce the fossil fuels, called fossil fuel because they wanted to make you think it was going to run out. There's probably more fossil fuel, if you want to call it, on the planet than there is water.
I was going to say, I've heard it's like the second most abundant
Absolutely,
liquid, because it's not an oil, it's a mineral. It's a mineral.
Think about it. It's being regenerated all the time in this cycle. Okay? So, you know, all of this is part of the cycle. Mm. So all the other cycles combined with this one, fossil fuel is being produced all the time. We're never going to run out. So let's have a look at carbon. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. We cannot increase the amount of carbon or carbon dioxide that already exists. It's just part of the cyclic process in nature's system. Absorption of CO2 produces carbohydrates in order to grow. Photosynthesis. They store the carbon, emit the oxygen, as I've said. Carbon compounds are passed from the producers, okay, to the consumers, which creates the food chain. So when they decompose, the carbon's released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The remainder forms fossil fuels, which, you know, when we use them, release CO2 when combusted. But we haven't created any more CO2 than existed, or any more carbon. It's always the same amount.
Same as water.
Same as water, exactly. Let's look at the oxygen cycle. Okay, so animals and plants breathe in the oxygen, emit the carbon dioxide, vegetation absorbs it through photosynthesis, and the plants create the oxygen for us to breathe. It's a very simple cycle. Let's have a look at another one. This one's a bit more technical, but yeah, I forgot to mention this. Oxygen is also produced by sunlight on water vapor, but very little. So the oxygen and carbon cycles are independent, but they're interlinked through the molecule, aren't they? That's the whole point. Aerobic organisms use free oxygen to breathe. Animals and humans breathe out the CO2 that's used by vegetation, meaning oxygen in the atmosphere is balanced, because nature always creates a balance. Compared to previous years, going back hundreds and thousands of years, the level of CO2 at the moment is not high, it's dangerously low. We ought to be burning more fossil fuels, not trying to suppress CO2. This raises suspicions of why the idea of suppressing CO2 is being played out. So the nitrogen cycle, this is the one that's a bit more technical, and I'll skip through it a bit because it takes a fair bit of understanding. Nitrogen is used by vegetation as a fertilizer. However, nitrogen as a gas, which is the most abundant gas on in the world, cannot be used by the plants, and they need a nitrogen fixing bacteria that turns it into usable nitrogen, called nitrifying. So they can absorb the vegetation, this form of nitrogen. We haven't lost the nitrogen, it's been converted to something else. Well, I mean, if you grow broad beans, anybody that grows broad beans, when you take them out and they're finished and you look at the roots, you see all these white nodules. They're all the fixed nitrogen that is there, which is why farmers in fallow field years would sow broad beans, not to grow them for food, but to plough them back in for the nitrogen. How much of that is being done today? Not that much. I wonder why. Anyway, as I said, nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere at about 78%. So these are the elements, these are the processes, if you like, that occur when nitrogen is converted. Atmospheric, biological, and industrial. The chemical processes are based on bacteria that convert the ammonia first to nitrites, and nitrites is the format that plants use as fertilizer. This is what the chemical companies sell you, you know, to fertilize your garden or field or whatever. But it's not necessary because nature's already provided what you need. Because some of these so-called chemical fertilizers are actually not very good.
Carcinogenic,
So,
most of them, aren't they?
Sorry?
Carcinogenic, most of them.
Oh, that's the problem. You know, let's not get on that subject. There are too many chemicals around this planet, all that have created a lot of money for, you know, a few people. So let's move on. So you have a choice. Accept nature's cycles that I've presented to you that show the complexity of actions and reactions in the natural world that make it impossible that only CO2 can affect global temperatures. Or accept the WF's and its government disciples' fake narrative, which is bicycles. What do I mean by that? What I mean is bicycles, this includes you. If the WEF get their way on climate change hopes, the only means of transport you'll be allowed is a bicycle. The problem here, you may have heard or not, that councils egged on by governments at the behest of WF want to impose 15-minute cities or sectors in cities in order to be able to impose lockdown in a government-declared climate emergency. You think that may not be possible? Well, we've seen lockdowns before, haven't we?
Although I would say that thanks to the previous lockdowns, I think they would have a much harder time trying to enforce this.
I do agree. How are you going to police it? You know, I mean, if people say no, you know, we're not doing it, we're not doing it. It depends on the power of the people, really, and what people forget, because, you know, globalist organizations create a fear. If you dispel the fear and say, we're bigger than you, there are more of us than of you, and that Absolutely. Empowers you. So if everybody got together, which is the idea of the community assembly organization, everybody got together and we agreed on something, because remember, in a community assembly, there is no hierarchy. We all discuss and agree between us, like a community should. So, how are these restrictions going to be enacted? Well, I've noticed, and I'm sure others have noticed, APNR cameras are being installed unseen and without any planning permission by police forces on all exit roads from towns, villages, or districts. This is on the pretext of keeping you safe from criminals. In Northampton, they say that ah, yes, well, the criminals get off the motorway and use Northampton as a rat run. Therefore, we have to have these cameras to see them. Well, who are the real criminals? Is this the beginning
installing
of
them.
a virtual open prison? So what is the scope and agenda? It's an ongoing attack on many fronts. And I've noticed over my time, my age, that the erosion of civil liberty has gathered pace, restricting the freedom of every man, woman, boy and girl, and continuing this modern version of slavery, and perpetuate further theft by governments, agencies, corporations and local councils, because that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
All the trademarks that were used once the previous lockdown had finished was net zero, build back better, global warming, low emission zones, ultra low emission zone, 15-minute cities, 2030 vision, smart cities, COVID, the great reset. And this constant repetition of these narratives by MSN and government, including sports organisations, when you read that somebody puts a comment on a sports channel about the cricket team flying out to the West Indies, I hope they've taken into account their effect on global warming. Well, you've got to laugh. And all mind manipulation. And it's designed to brainwash
Bill Gates. Bill Gates uses the most carbon, doesn't he?
Look, if we wanted, let me take you as an aside here. If you were really concerned on ultra low emission zone, okay, say in London, because of the effect of, the emissions, why have you not banned cremations in London? There are 24 crematoriums. Every cremation causes as much CO2, okay, as a car running 700 miles. Now, bearing in mind, there are 1,000 cremations a day. Yeah, that's an awful lot of miles. In India, they use the funeral pyres, okay? Each funeral pyre produces 8 million tons of CO2 from the wood burning and everything else. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
So, here's how they manipulate this mind manipulation, brainwashing. Here's a lovely picture of temperatures in Europe with a green background. Notice the temperatures that are there.
Yeah.
This was in 2017. Let's have a look at one that was used in 2022. Same map, coloured red. But look at it. The temperatures are actually lower. This is fear porn.
Of course, it's propaganda.
Red to make you go alarmist. Okay? That's the falsity. If global warming was real, why would you need to do that? Why would you need to change the background of the picture if it was real? So, according to reports, many parts of Europe have had record-breaking temperatures. Oh, surprise, surprise. Well, that's easy to fake, isn't it? Just change how temperature is measured. Air temperature. Temperature is measured 1.5 meters from the ground in the shade. I have a thermometer on my garden wall, which is in the shade and measures temperature. They now measure it on asphalted ground. So I thought, okay, on a nice warm day in the summer, I went to my thermometer. And on the left is the one that was on the wall, showing about 20 degrees. I immediately picked it up and took it outside and put it on the tarmac. Remember, asphalt is a black body. A black body absorbs light and creates additional heat. Look at the temperature within a minute of putting it on the tarmac. Oh, I've broken the record for temperatures. I accept that cities, okay, will have a slightly higher temperature than rural areas because of all the concrete and construction that's around. But generally, the mean temperature over the whole land will not change. So I found this particular piece of newspaper cutting on the 11th of October 1921. It said, a phenomenal heat wave is being experienced in London. All existing records are broken. In Paris, the temperature has broken the record since 1857. It was recorded that temperatures of 40 degrees centigrade were reached in London and Paris. Oh, this would have been the real temperature, of course. I stated earlier, the solar cycle is 11 years, and in each cycle there are peaks of sunspot activity and increased radiated heat. 1857 to 1921 is 64 years, approximately 5 or 6 cycles. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Do we remember 1976? It was the hottest summer we had in the UK with 8 weeks of high temperatures. What is the difference in number between 1976 and 1921? Oh, 55 years. Another peak.
So basically, are they much like in the olden times where they would trick the masses when there was a solar eclipse coming, because they knew the patterns, they were able to use that knowledge to trick the rest of the people?
Yes. I mean, look, this brings into other things, which I'm not going to go into, I'm just going to allude to, right? And this is not conspiracy theorist. We were all brought up and given at school and at home a globe, weren't we?
Yeah. There's a lot of flat earthers on my channel, just so you know.
Exactly. Well, my view is the science doesn't bear up, really. I'm not going to go any further.
Okay.
It was a guy that we used to call, when I was at grammar school, Copernicus, who postulated that the Earth goes round the sun, whereas before that, it was thought that the sun goes round the Earth. I'll leave it there. So let's go and have a look at this then. Given the weight of real evidence, I think you'll agree a 12-year-old would conclude on this level of science, which is real science, that CO2 cannot be responsible for any increases in global temperature. It's clear that all of this has been planned for quite some time. We do know that the US military started in 1945 looking at weather manipulation as a battlefield weapon, the ability to create drought or floods and even earthquakes. Okay. So a lot of the things that we think are natural disasters that are happening may not be. There's certainly an argument that net zero is a tax grabbing idea. And we really need to increase fossil fuel and availability, which will bring more prosperity, increased plant growth, and more oxygen. I rest my case.
Very good case. That was very interesting. Thank you. And yeah, I think the majority of I don't want to say normal people because normal is boring, but the majority of people, I think, they know this. It's just that anyone's silenced, aren't they, on like mainstream platforms, and so the real side never actually gets their voices heard, which is why it's important to
Well,
have channels like this.
One of the things, Chris, that is clear to me that in education, there's been a dumbing down for many, many years.
Mm.
The level of science, maths, chemistry that is now taught in schools, right, compared to when I was at school, and I'm not trying to make myself anything clever here, right, is at the level that we used to do in fourth form at grammar school. Not even at university, we'd done all that. And therefore, the number of people, men and women in the land that really understand science, right, has diminished, which is why I created this, to say, don't be frightened of science, because everything that I'm showing you, you can allude to. You know these things are happening. You know there are cycles. And that's why I created it in this manner.
No, that's great. Is there anywhere people can go to see more of your work? Have you got a website or have you got?
I never created a website because my I've never charged for anything that I do, and I never wanted to give the impression. And I've seen lots of these on, the internet, that I've created all this to run a business. I'm doing it because I believe him up there, right, gave me the talent and has brought me to this point to say, you've got the talent, you go out and broadcast the message, which is why I appeal to you, right? If you have the ability to put it out there, share it, because out of that, I'm more than happy to create subsequent PowerPoint presentations that follow on from this.
No, that's brilliant. Well, I appreciate the work that you've put in. I hope everyone who has watched this has found it very insightful. There's a few things on there which I didn't know, so I've most certainly learned a few bits along the way. So that's always a bonus, in all seriousness. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on and
I'm
sharing.
happy if you want to share this to receive emails from anyone that would like a little bit more information or how they can get involved. And the email address is quite simple. It's CA Community Assembly -Daventry @protonmail.com.
Cool. I'll leave your email link in the video description, and then people can just click on that, and that will take them straight to it.
Yeah, and it's only if people are interested, need more information, or would like to spread the message even further.
Brilliant. That's fantastic, and thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah.
Now I've got to go.
And I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Yes, without a doubt. Without a doubt. But for now, everyone watching at home, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and until next time, goodbye from me.